Next we have from Kino Flo, actually the founder of Kino Flo, the inventor of all that technology, an icon in the industry, Frieder Hochheim.
Thank you very much for that introduction. I guess you may have all noticed there's a lot of LEDs out there. And the challenge of all of this is, how do we actually make this so that it works right for the camera? So the presentation I'm going to give you today is a Reader's Digest of what normally takes an hour and a bit. So I'm just going to touch on the key points, and it's basically going to explain our approach to our LED technology and how we are trying to present the solution to today's cinematographer. So I'm just going to briefly touch on various spectral measurement indexes. We all have meters that give us information. What do we do with that? I want to talk about the principle of full spectrum white light, the differences in white light. There's a lot of it out there. And the challenges of color matching between all of us different manufacturers. So when you get us all on a set together, you don't bash your head against the wall and wonder why none of this is working right. So every new cinema camera is like a film stock. In the old days, we had Fuji, we had Kodak. They had their distinct emulsions. We all knew what their nuances and their characteristics were like. They had spectral response curves that were different from each other, and the cinematographer chose a film stock based on the response curves or the sort of the textural quality and the color quality of the film stock. So the electronic cinema camera, no different, except now instead of 3 or 4 or 5 film stocks, we've got 20 or more. In the past, we had full spectrum light in so many respects. When you think of arc light, tungsten, xenon arcs, HMI, even the fluorescent had more spectrum than today's LEDs. When you actually look at the full spectrum, we were able to get the green out, even though it had like a mercury line. But for the most part, we're talking full spectrum. LED lights, by their very nature, are discontinuous. So since all the cameras have unique response curves, that means that even on the same light source of an LED, different cameras are going to see the same source differently. So now how do we determine where these differences fall? Well, we've got a plethora of handheld devices, sadly none of which really address our concerns today. There are various measurement parameters. You can measure Kelvin, you can measure XY, you can TM3015. There's all these CRI, TLCI, SSI, on and on and on. Sadly, none of them really give us actionable data on what to do with a particular camera once you are confronted with that light source. Now, maybe the closest will be the Sekonic C800 that's on the market more recently. They're using an average spectral response curve from HDSLRs, so it's maybe a good comparative meter, but when it comes to specifically solving a camera problem, this is not going to do the trick. So with that as the foundation, where do we go from here? So at Kino Flo, we said the only way this is going to work is we have to develop our own spectrometer, one that actually takes into account what the camera sees. So what we came up with, we basically modeled a whole bunch of cameras. The process in and of itself was a big challenge. And so this is what my workspace looks like. I have a process spectrum, which in this case is about a 2700 is what I think we've dialed in. Down over here we have the CIE color space chart. It gives us an XY position on a black body curve. We have three rows of camera data. In this case, I have an Amira, a red Mysterium, and a Panavision red K sensor. So that, in detail, looks more like this. Along the bottom, we have data that is what we call photographic rendering index, using very much the same methodology as CRI, which is for your photopic vision, your eye's vision. We use a similar calculation. So using a Macbeth chart with 18 color spaces, we measure the light quality off of that and apply a photographic rendering index that is predicated on the response curve of the camera. CRI is your photopic curve, your eye curve. We're taking the camera curve and putting it in. Now we're actually seeing what the camera sees. And one last area of interest for us is how does that actually work itself into a color correction, be it a green magenta, as it affects skin tone. So up in the top we have a gel field where it tells us in very fine detail whether we are below the Planckian curve, above the Planckian curve. Do we need to add magenta or a little bit of green? In this case, in this example, there's no correction necessary. It falls well within the dynamics of the camera. So we really need to understand what, in fact, when we talk about white light, what are we talking about? Well, here on the left, the chromosticity diagram, on that outside perimeter is where all our saturated colors are. Here in the middle are the whites. Our eyes can see from 400 to 700 nanometers. Anything above 700 is IR. Below 400, we're looking into the UV. So this is visible light as we can see it. We need to understand what the Planckian locus is. The black body curve, also known as the Planckian locus, developed by Max Planck. White light tracks along this curve. Now, above the curve, it'll be looking kind of green. Below it, it falls kind of magenta. Now, any one of those vertical lines you see there is a Kelvin. So your color point can fall anywhere on that vertical line and be true to the Kelvin. But depending on where it falls above or below, you're going to see it as either a magenta or a green cast. So as we developed our color space, we've chosen to work with two full spectrum whites. We know about full spectrum white because of all of our previous lamp developments. So when you track or combine two Kelvins, they track linearly on a linear track, which means when you get to the middle, you're falling into a magenta zone. So if you're simply doing bicolor blending, you're going to fall off the Planckian curve and you're going to have color problems when it comes to a skin tone. So what do? We add RGB to our two whites. And working with RGBs, we lift it and track the Planckian curve. Now, part of our research shows that it's not just important to follow the Planckian curve. We saw that cameras actually vary from the Planckian. Some cameras track above, some below, and not only that, some will track above, let's say in the warm tones, and as you go into blue, it'll track below. So unless you know the profile of the camera, there is not one setting you can put on this instrument and say it's going to hold throughout the entire Kelvin range. That's a challenge. Just to give you an idea of what our eye sees, we've seen some charts before, but this is how light scientists look at light. So this is your spectral distribution chart. So what we have down here is, again, the 400 nanometer range. Anything to that direction is into the ultraviolet. Over here, everything to the right is IR. And this is how our eye sees light. Transposed over top of that, this is a typical film response curve. And again, now we see the differences between our eye and film. And so we see very dramatically here, the blue response goes into the UV, which is the reason we had sky filters and UV filters on our cameras to try to take down that sensitivity into the UV. We also notice how on the red response, it shifted to the right. Now, this arrangement of color sensitivity also accounts for the fact why on film there were certain colors that just did not reproduce. And it was so incumbent on art directors, makeup people, and cinematographers to do the color testing before the show starts. So if there's a particular color that you want to reproduce, you damn well better make sure that the film's actually seeing it that way. So this is old history. This is where we were. So let's go now to where we are. Now, this is a typical camera response from an electronic cinema camera that's very popular. I'm not going to identify any of the cameras because it's not a matter of is something better or worse. It's a matter of the differences. So this is one camera. And by the way, and we just see how close to our eye response this is. So very closely matched to the eye response. Here's another camera. Again, we start to see differences here. We're on the blue sensitivity. We're actually catching a little bit of UV. And we see that the red response is a little broader. This is not a negative or a positive. This is just the way it is. Here's another one. Again, all these cameras are top-of-the-line cinema cameras that render fabulous results, but we're seeing how these cameras perceive light differently. So given that as sort of a preface, there are this and many other ways of doing white light. So one of the first was to just simply take two full spectrum Kelvins and mix them up, and we see where the challenges lie in that regard. Very common is using a single white in RGB. A lot of manufacturers are doing that. Kino Flo is choosing 2 whites in RGB. There's some other manufacturers doing that as well. And then you get into a range where you are working with a lot of different colors. Some white, there are many more which don't use any white. They try to fill in as much of the spectrum as you can with as many narrow spectrum light sources, which in and of itself creates challenges in software, challenges in pricing. I mean, these are all costs. So that is just an overview of how the market right now is, and that's what we're walking into as a cinematographer. You've got all those different ways of working, and now you're going to try and make that all work together. So, not all white light is the same. Here, just to keep this presentation short, I'm just picking on 2, just to give you an illustration. At 3200, the green line represents 2 whites. The orange line below it is a single white, and you start to see these lines represent the spectrum that is being outputted. We have to pay attention to this zone over here. This is a 450 emitter line. This is what every LED has. It's the blue exciter that halates the phosphor. And what we try to do is avoid a deep valley. There's very little color that is picking up in that zone. So it does affect our overall color rendering. So between the 2 whites and a single white, we're seeing that the 2 whites have a larger volume of spectrum. How does that work out as we move into our analysis? Well, the XY coordinates, and we just took 2 instruments and dialed them into the same settings. In this case, we match by all measures, usually up until this point on an XY meter, you'd say it's a dead nuts match. We're happy. Well, but let's take into account how a camera might see that. So along the bottom row, we have our photographic rendering indexes, all very good. Anything in the 90s, I think we should accept as being pretty darn decent. As we go up into the color corrections, we're seeing on the 2 whites, there's no correction necessary, but on the other 2, one on the Amira, the same source on the Amira, and the same source on a red Mysterium, and you start to see the difference in how 2 cameras look at the same light source differently. So these are the numbers which then truly affect skin tone. So if you're looking at a skin tone, they're going to look greenish, and you got to take that out. Here's a quick glance at a 6500. Again, you can see the difference in spectrum. We're dealing with a very deep dip here in this. It was about 475 nanometer. And how does that work out? So on the XYs, again, here's calibration between instruments, slight offset in the XY, which is not the end of the world. But we look at the breakout. Again, photographic renderings will be pretty decent. And when we come up to the color correction, again, on skin tone, we see that there's a slight correction, not as much as before, but a slight correction. So again, this is an ongoing sort of situation. And just for a quick point of comparison, normally I have a lot more charts to get into, but this is where you're working with a lot of different colors and not necessarily any white at all. And you can start to see how different in overall volume and spectrum we are capturing with the full whites versus just a constructed spectrum. Again, XY coordinates are slightly offset, which is fine. On the PRI, we're still looking at decent numbers. And on the correction, here's a big difference between the 2 whites over here and the multicolor. We can see up here how there's a much larger correction necessary. Yet on the red Mysterium, looking at the same multicolor, it's perfectly acceptable. So this is what we're facing. We're facing a lot of these incongruities. There's not one rule that holds true for everything. So this is what we're dealing with. So how can we, first of all, how do we match any of these sources that we have on a set? How can we harmonize these fixtures? Well, what I just illustrated is you can't fully harmonize them. You can bring them into the same color point, but you may see differences in your green magenta and how your skin tone renders. So it can match the color points, but depending on the camera, it's going to be more or less discernible. So what we did is we said, okay, just as Kodak baked the color science into the emulsion, and all you had to do is illuminate the film. We're going to say we're introducing baked-in color science into the instrument. You pick your camera. The instrument, in terms of its light quality, harmonizes to the camera that you've selected. So we're baking our color science into the light. We just finished a show in London. John Schwartzman, ASC, did a picture over there using the Panavision DXL. All the Kinos were harmonized to the lookup table. He said it was pristine. So we know it's working. So what do we've got? We've got the Alexa, the Venice, the DXL, and the VariCam. At this point, we're looking at adding a lot more other cameras, and we're hoping that the camera manufacturers see the benefit in sharing this kind of information, because I think it will bring everyone up to a much higher level. The other thing we're doing on our instruments, we're adding an XY color matching mode. So if you're trying to hone in on the same color point, be it either white or RGB, we're going to give you that option. The Sekonic C800 and some of the handheld spectrometers give you XY capability of measuring light. You should be able to take that information and dial it in on the fixture, with one caveat. Those are scientific instruments. They're very precise. Our instruments, because of various calibrations and just the tolerances of these panels, some adjustment will be necessary once you've dialed it in. So it's not the be-all and end-all. It's not the first time up. It takes a little bit of tweaking and tuning. The other thing is we're looking at, or we have in our beta format, we've added color gamut selection. So for RGBs, it's very important to, and there's a whole 15 minutes I can spend on RGB, but to keep this tight, if you can harmonize, if you can, as manufacturers from instrument to instrument, pick the same gamut, our software is designed to map out the RGB color points within that gamut. And once you have a common gamut, in theory, the instruments will line up. Love theory. In summary, so color indexes, a lot of them out there, provide some information, but not really any actionable data. All white Kelvin is not created equal. Understand those differences. When XY coordinates are matched, some correction or adjustment may still be necessary. So in conclusion, just like the great masters of Rembrandt and Vermeer chose their pigments carefully, today's cinematographers must choose their spectral palettes carefully as well. A good spot, broad spectrum white, goes a long way in solving color rendering. If camera manufacturers would they do a great service if they share their response curves, offering camera lookup tables, I think removes many of the concerns about LEDs not rendering correctly on camera. Introducing gamut harmonization for XY and RGB color points will help match between manufacturers, and there's an industry movement moving forward to get people to start understanding that. It's important to note today's color science is the 21st century pigment. The fixtures are the brushes. Choose your pigment wisely, or suffer the incongruities when color grading. Thank you. I hope I stayed within my 15 minutes. There was a lot there.
Thank you for helping to sort all this out.
It's a complex issue, and I hope I just sort of give you an oversight of what is really going on, and to try to harmonize all this stuff. It's tough enough for one manufacturer to get it right. It's really tough to get everyone to harmonize and come together on it. So ESTA is one of the organizations that is suggesting an ESTA gamut space, which is an odd space because they use, instead of daylight, they use tungsten as their white point, which it goes against all other color indexes that are out there. So that's a little confusing. But anyway, we're all working on it.
We're going to be working with the Academy, SciTech Council, to try to do some education in this area too.
Yeah, the SSI from the Academy sadly also suffers the same issue, that there is no actionable data that we can get off of that. These indexes are great to sort of give you an idea of what how a light compares to tungsten or daylight. But our eye is one thing and the camera is the other thing, and we see how the camera eye and the eye actually, in some cases, is very, very close. In others, it's not. But
it's a complicated situation.
It's complicated.
We appreciate a smart guy like you getting into it and trying to figure it out.
It's not all my work. I've got great smart people working for me. So, thank you.
Thank you.